notes, turn to the page. Actually, guys, listen please. This, Haley, this first slide you don't have. We added it afterwards. So just listen for this for right now. So what we're going to do, we talk about the sort of general characteristics of all the domains and the kingdoms and so forth. We're going to get a little more specific. We're just going to briefly mention Archaea and bacteria today, and then we won't really come back to them. And then we're going to start to talk about protists and the other groups in our next couple units. And we do more with protists in plants and animals than we do with the other groups. So Archaea, as you know, they, as we talked about yesterday, they get their own domain. Okay, it's called Archaea. Okay, so they're in that domain. Their kingdom is also called Archaea. And we just went over this, but remind me, how many cells, raise your hand, are Archaea? Tatum? Yeah, they're single cells, unicellular. Tell me about their nucleus, or a word we'd use to describe that. Matt? Prokaryote. They're prokaryote. Their cells do not have a nucleus. Their DNA is just sort of in the cytoplasm, not enclosed in a nuclear membrane. Also, they don't have other organelles, membrane-bound organelles. Okay, so they don't have mitochondria, chloroplasts, and things like that. Prokaryotes are very simple cells. As far as their nutrition and how they get energy, well, some are autotrophs, and there's some unique Archaea, which actually, rather than using sunlight to make food, they actually can use certain chemicals that are released from deep inside the earth, and they have some unique ways of making their own food. It's called chemosynthesis, using chemicals to make their own food.
Will we have to know that for the test?
No. As far as reproduction, Archaea reproduce asexually, so they basically just split, they copy themselves. But they do have a way of exchanging genetic information that they can, and we'll talk about that with bacteria, they can trade some genetic information. And the example are what we call extremophiles. These are organisms that can survive very, very extreme conditions. And Archaea weren't really discovered until relatively recently because scientists thought nothing would be able to survive in these conditions. Some that are called thermophiles can survive, temperatures of greater than 170 degrees Fahrenheit. Some can survive temperatures hotter than boiling. And again, that's unique. Bacteria, for example, if you cook your meat to 160 degrees, basically killed off all the bacteria that would be in it. These thermophiles can live in much warmer conditions. Some types of Archaea can survive very, very acidic conditions that nothing else can. So they're called acidophiles. An acid, yeah, they can live in very acidic conditions. Some can grow with almost no water, extremely dry conditions. They're called xerophiles. Some can live in super, super salty conditions like in the Dead Sea and in certain areas where nothing else is living. And they're called halophiles. And these Archaea are a very, very old, ancient group of living things. Okay? In that the early Earth, as the Earth was just formed and was changing in its early days, conditions were quite extreme. And so these Archaea had evolved in those extreme conditions. Okay? And so they have those abilities to live in extreme conditions today. All right, you do have this slide. So bacteria also have their own domain. We can call it bacteria. It actually has another name, Monera, but we're just going to call it bacteria. And they have their own kingdom as well, kingdom of bacteria. And bacteria are also single-celled, unicellular. They're also prokaryotes. Some are autotrophs. So some types of bacteria can make their own food through photosynthesis. Others are heterotrophs and they have to consume other matter, other material in order to get energy. Bacteria also have a cell wall. What other type of organism did we say had a cell wall? Plants. But the cell wall in bacteria is actually made of different materials. It's not made of cellulose, it's made of other materials. It's also different than the cell wall found in a fungus. Bacteria reproduce asexually, although again they can exchange some genetic information with each other through a process called conjugation, where one bacteria and another bacteria, they swap a little section of DNA. And so actually traits can be passed from one bacteria to another through this swapping of DNA. Like if one bacteria develops a resistance to an antibiotic, another bacteria can get that same resistance by this transfer. So there's lots of examples of bacteria, and some you may be familiar with. Streptococcus causes strep throat. You ever had that? Staphylococcus causes a staph infection. You've heard of that. E. coli, type of bacteria that some varieties can cause food poisoning. Blue-green algae, bless you. Algae is actually a misnomer. It's not actually an algae. It's not a plant. It's actually a bacteria that can photosynthesize to make its own food, but it's a type of bacteria. Okay? There you have some examples of some of these types of bacteria. Okay? You have strep bacteria, staph bacteria. Okay, you have E. coli and blue-green algae. Staph infection often is like a skin infection often are caused by this bacteria. Like you ever heard of MRSA? MRSA. It's a resistant type of staph infection, sometimes spread through contact, like sometimes in schools. MRSA may spread, especially sometimes in sports like wrestling or football, where there's a lot of exchange of pads and there's a lot of body-to-body contact, can spread some of these things or mats onto people, and so they have to disinfect them each time so that there's no staph infections that can spread. And you don't have this slide. This is sort of the same thing. I just want to show you some pictures here. So the same information, but this is interesting. This shows the head of a pen, the purple, and all these yellow things are groups of bacteria. Bacteria are quite small. They're even much smaller. The cells we looked at, like onion cells, cheek cells, bacteria are much, much smaller than those cells. If you were to look at bacteria through our high power and our compound microscopes, it's still very, very tiny. You can't see too much there.
I have a question.
Yes.
So like basically everything is bacteria.
Everything is bacteria.
Well, no, basically everything, like a lot of things are bacteria.
Bacteria are very common, yeah. They're found all over the
So
place.
I could like do bacteria.
There's bacteria on that waterhouse. And bacteria are classified partially based on their shape. There's different shapes that bacteria come in. One shape are these sort of rods, okay, called bacillus. Others are spheres, okay, they're called coccus. And some have a twisted shape, sort of coiled spiral shape. And here are some examples of some of those various shapes of bacteria. This is Streptococcus, strep throat bacteria. Okay, again, it's called Streptococcus because it's one of these sphericals, like little balls. That's the shape of the strep bacteria. This is Staphylococcus. Again, you can tell from the name, also a spherical bacteria. It grows in little chunks and groups rather than sort of these straight lines. E. coli are rod-shaped bacteria that you see over here. And then blue-green algae are some of these spiral bacteria. All right, so that's just a little bit of information about archaea and bacteria. We're not really going to get into much more detail than that. But these organisms were some of the very first living things on Earth. Archaea and bacteria had evolved before any other plant or animal or fungus or protist. And those other types of living things evolved from branches from these kingdoms. So we're going to watch a little bit of a video here that's going to sort of talk about some of these very, very early organisms that evolved on the early Earth.